How are you, Professor? So good to see you on Authorlink today. We are
Thank you
so
very much.
excited to talk to you about your latest book, Extraterrestrial, and we're looking forward to hearing all of your theories. We were going to summarize in some way the premise of your book, but we think probably best that you go ahead and do that, given that you're the expert in this area. So just tell us a little bit about extraterrestrial.
Right. Well, there are two ways to start the story. One is when I was born, and I grew up on a farm and had a very strong connection to nature, and that pretty much guided me throughout my career. And the one vivid memory I have from my childhood was sitting at the dinner table and asking a difficult question, and the adults in the room would often dismiss the question because they didn't know the answer to it. And I thought of science as a way of maintaining my childhood curiosity and trying to look for evidence and answer the question without any pretension that I know the answer in advance, or just being guided by evidence. And to my surprise, the scientific community right now in academia is guided by other considerations, not necessarily evidence, but maintaining an image of an expert that knows the answer in advance, or not engaging in questions that are really exciting, but for which we don't know the answer yet, because by engaging in those, you are taking some risk. So there are risks taken by the mainstream of scientific community, like, for example, studying the nature of dark matter, and they didn't lead anywhere in 4 decades. There are people even considering topics like extra dimensions, the multiverse, that will never be explored experimentally. We will never get evidence on them just because it's socially accepted. And however, discussing something like us that may have emerged near another star is considered outside of the scope of mainstream science, which is really strange because we exist. We send equipment to space. Why not search for others? So that's one aspect of it. And the second is that I was interested in the big picture. And, the biggest question that we can ask is, are we alone? Are we the smartest kid on the block? And as a kid, I was mostly interested in philosophy, and I somehow ended up as a physicist, as an astrophysicist. So that's one starting point when I grew up as a child, and I haven't changed much since then. And the second starting point is 2017, when an object showed up in the sky that was discovered by a telescope in Hawaii called Pan-STARRS. And that object was given the name Oumuamua, which means in the Hawaiian language, a scout or a messenger from afar. And it didn't resemble any of the rocks we have seen before in the solar system. It didn't look like a comet. There was no cometary tail. And as it was tumbling, the amount of sunlight reflected from it changed by a factor of 10. That meant a very extreme shape, most likely flat, pancake-like. And then it exhibited an excess push away from the sun. And the only way that I could explain it is by reflection of sunlight. And for that, the object had to be very thin. And I suggested that it's not natural, it's artificial, because nature doesn't make very thin objects. And in September 2020, there was another object that was pushed away from the sun by reflecting sunlight, no cometary tail. It was given the name 2020 SO, and it ended up being a rocket booster that NASA launched in 1966. So here is an example of an artificial object that we produced. The question is, who produced Oumuamua? And that is really the subject of my book, Extraterrestrial, trying to discuss the possible implications of finding a piece of equipment manufactured by a smarter kid on our cosmic block. And, I think it's the most exciting possibility that we should explore in science. There is a huge amount. I mean, my book was translated to 25 languages and became bestseller in many countries. I had 2,000 interviews over the past year, but altogether, I think it's a subject the public cares a lot about. And, the evidence for that is that several very wealthy individuals came to the porch of my home. They were inspired by the book, and they donated $2 million that allowed me to fund a research project called the Galileo Project to search for other objects like Oumuamua and take a close-up photograph of them.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes, it's very exciting about the other find in 2020 of the other potential space junk that happens to be in the same sort of format as our space sail of 2017 that we're not sure where it's coming from, but yet the one that we discovered in 2020 is actually our own. Has there been any others around that have been discovered since 2020?
No, I should say that there was nothing reported. And the reason these were found relatively recently over the past 5 years is because prior to that, we never had a telescope like Pan-STARRS that surveys the sky and can detect an object the size of a football field from the reflection of sunlight. I should say that we never launched a spacecraft that is as big as a football field. We didn't do that. So there might be many more smaller objects passing through that we haven't noticed. And the reason that Pan-STARRS was surveying the sky is because in 2005, Congress tasked NASA to find 90% of all the objects bigger than 140 meters that could potentially collide with Earth, because we are smarter than the dinosaurs. They were not smart enough to develop telescopes, and then they didn't look up, and then a giant rock the size of Manhattan Island hit the ground and tarnished their ego trip. They disappeared. We are smarter. We can search the sky for objects that may impact Earth and cause some catastrophes locally, much smaller than the Chicxulub impactor that killed the dinosaurs. And that was the reason that Pan-STARRS was established as a survey of the sky, and in the process of surveying the sky, it found the first object from outside the solar system. Now, what's the chance that the first object from outside the solar system would appear so anomalous, so different than comets or asteroids? The second object that was discovered by an amateur astronomer called Borisov is just like a comet we have seen before. It's completely standard. And so we currently know of two objects that came from outside the solar system. One of them looks very strange. I was asked, actually, is the fact that we discovered the second one to be a familiar comet, doesn't it convince me that it's even the first one is natural? And my point is that if you walk on the beach and you see a plastic bottle, and then after that you see rocks that are naturally produced, it doesn't make the plastic bottle a rock. In fact, it makes it more unusual.
Right. I love all the different explanations, about 6 explanations for why this is a peculiar and exotic type of space sail. But let me leave it to you to explain these differences. For instance, the difference between a comet and an asteroid, the gas that projects it forward, how it's been given the energy to move from the sun, its surface area, how in the beginning it seemed to be, accordingly to the first scientist analyzing this item, that it was like a cigar shape, but actually your theory is that it was almost like a piece of paper that thin, that it was just floating. And its trajectory was also very interesting, how it actually had a purpose. So please, yes, go ahead, because I'm not going to be able to articulate it as well as you, for sure.
Well, you did a very good job, actually, but it was strange in many different ways. First of all, it came from a special frame of reference, which is called the local standard of rest. And that's the frame that you get to when you average over the random motions of all the stars in the vicinity of the sun relative to each other. So it's sort of like being at the town center. And, you know, if you are in a parking lot and you are at rest relative to the parking lot, you still see cars moving relative to you. These are the stars moving relative to the local frame of reference of the Milky Way galaxy. And the sun is also moving relative to the local standard of rest. So this object ended up being at rest, like a parked car. Or another way to think of it is like a buoy sitting at rest on the surface of the ocean, and then the solar system bumped into it like a giant ship. And the only 1 in 500 stars is so much at rest as this one was. And the question is, why is it so unusual? If it came from another star, then it should have inherited the motion of that star. For it to be at rest means that it's very unusual. And then in addition to that, this object had a very extreme shape. As you said, it was the amount of sunlight it reflected changed by a factor of 10 as it was tumbling every 8 hours. And at first, the artist depiction of it was like a cigar. But the way to think of this, if you see a piece of paper tumbling in the wind, then when it's sideways, it looks like a cigar projected. But in reality, it is flat. And based on the variation of light, the best fit at the 90% confidence to the variation of light was that of a flat object, pancake-like. And then finally, it was pushed away from the sun and most likely by reflecting sunlight, which is very unusual because there was no cometary tail. The Spitzer Space Telescope searched very deeply around it, couldn't find any carbon-based molecules. There was no heat detected from it, which meant that it must be smaller than 200 meters in size. So it's rather compact and has a high reflectance. And there was no jitters in its trajectory that would come naturally from a cometary evaporation, because they usually occur in special locations on the surface of a comet. So a comet is just a rock that is covered with ice, and then the ice evaporates when it gets heated by sunlight. And very often the ice is located in craters in some special locations, and as a result you get jets that push the object, and it usually jitters because of the tumbling motion, and there was no such jitter in the case of Oumuamua. Also, the ice often doesn't get evaporated beyond a certain distance from the sun, so this object exhibited an excess push also beyond that distance where ice sublimates. So it had a lot of anomalies, and of course the mainstream of the experts that are used to explain everything in the sky in terms of rocks argue that it's a rock of a type that was never seen before, like a chunk of frozen hydrogen. So then we can't see the hydrogen when it evaporates. We've never seen a chunk of frozen hydrogen. It cannot be produced in a planetary system like our own. It has to be produced in a molecular cloud. We don't know if such chunks exist, and also they would not survive the journey over millions of years through interstellar space. And then there was a suggestion maybe it's a chunk of frozen nitrogen chipped off the surface